The year was 1945. Romania was a land of ghosts, ruins, and shifting shadows. The smoke of World War II had barely cleared when a new, colder darkness began to stretch across the Carpathian Mountains. The Soviet Red Army had moved in as liberators, but they stayed as occupiers, bringing with them the iron-fisted ideology of Marxist-Leninism. Richard Wurmbrand, a man of Jewish descent who had found Christ in the mid-1930s, stood at the epicenter of this cultural earthquake. He was a man of high intellect, fluent in 9 languages, but his true strength lay in his refusal to accept any king other than the one who wore a crown of thorns. While other religious leaders were looking for ways to compromise with the new regime, Wurmbrand was preparing for a collision. Before we descend into the cells of Jalava, let us know where you are watching from. This archive documents the global remnant. Mark your location in the comments. The communist regime realized they could not immediately liquidate the church. They had to subvert it. In the spring of 1945, they organized the Congress of Cults in the Parliament building in Bucharest. Imagine the scene: over 4,000 religious leaders, Orthodox priests in their heavy vestments, Catholic bishops and Protestant pastors, sitting under massive blood-red banners of the hammer and sickle. High above the podium hung a giant portrait of Joseph Stalin. One by one, these leaders stood and declared that Stalin was the protector of the faith, and that communism was the fulfillment of the gospel. It was a festival of apostasy, a public ritual of spiritual surrender. Wurmbrand sat in the audience with his wife, Sabina. Sabina was a woman forged in the fires of the Holocaust. She had lost her entire family to the Nazis and knew that a peace bought with a lie was no peace at all. As the leaders continued to pledge their loyalty to the state, Sabina leaned into Richard and whispered, "Richard, stand up and wash this shame off the face of Christ." Richard looked at her, his voice a low, heavy whisper, "If I do, you will lose your husband." Sabina's response was the ultimate signature of the inland spirit. "I do not wish to have a coward for a husband." Wurmbrand stood. He walked to the podium through a sea of compromised men. When he reached the microphone, he didn't attack the party. He simply exalted the king. He told the 4,000 leaders that their first and final loyalty belonged to God, not the state. He spoke of the church as a sovereign body that could never be a department of the government. The hall went silent. The communist officials on the stage were paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the moment. For 10 minutes, the truth was the only sound in the room. Then the microphones were cut. The guards moved in. Wurmbrand walked out of that hall a marked man. He had publicly shamed the dragon, and the dragon would not forget. For the next 3 years, Wurmbrand lived in a state of active martyrdom. He knew his house was bugged. He knew he was being followed by the Securitate, the secret police. Yet he accelerated his work. He organized a massive underground distribution of Bibles to the occupying Russian soldiers, men who had been told God was a myth. He developed the tactics of the underground, dividing the church into small groups of 3 to 5 to prevent total liquidation if one member was arrested, preparing his congregation not for blessing, but for suffering. He taught them how to pray while being beaten and how to memorize scripture for the day they would no longer have a Bible. On February 29, 1948, the net closed. While Wurmbrand was walking to a secret church service, a black van belonging to the Securitate screeched to a halt beside him. He was kidnapped, not arrested. No warrant was produced. No rights were read. He was shoved into the back of the van, a black hood pulled over his eyes. For the next 8.5 years, Richard Wurmbrand would be a non-person. His name was erased from the census. His family was told he had fled the country or that he was a spy or that he was dead. In reality, he was descending into Jalava prison, a subterranean fortress built 30 feet below the earth. He was about to enter a world where the sun never shone, and where the only voice he would hear for years would be the rhythmic dripping of water on cold stone. When the black van arrived at Jalava prison, Wurmbrand was led into a world that the sun had long since forgotten. Jalava was an 18th century fortress, repurposed by the communist regime into a human disposal site. It was built 30 feet underground, encased in massive stone walls that wept with constant condensation. The air was a heavy soup of dampness, carbon dioxide, and the metallic tang of rot. As he was led down the spiraling stone stairs, the sounds of the surface world, the wind, the birds, the distant hum of traffic, died away, replaced by the rhythmic, heavy clanging of iron bolts. He was pushed into a cell so narrow he could touch both walls by extending his elbows. Wurmbrand spent years in solitary confinement. In the secret police manual, this was the desert phase. The objective was to create a total sensory vacuum. There were no windows and no clocks. The guards wore felt-soled shoes to ensure their approach was silent. The communists believed that if you removed all external stimuli from a human being, the mind would eventually consume itself. They expected Wurmbrand to descend into madness or to beg for the company of an interrogator by confessing his crimes. But the dragon made a fatal error. They underestimated the connectivity of the remnant. Though the prisoners were separated by feet of cold stone, they were not alone. Wurmbrand discovered that the walls themselves could speak. Through a system of Morse code tapping, the prisoners began to communicate. A tap on a pipe or a rhythmic knock on a stone wall became the nervous system of an underground church. Imagine the scene. In the dead of night, Wurmbrand would press his ear against the damp stone. From 3 cells away, a brother would tap out a verse from the Psalms. Wurmbrand would tap back a word of encouragement. They began to hold secret services. A pastor in one cell would tap out a sermon. 100 prisoners would listen with their ears pressed to the cold masonry. They were abiding together in a digital liturgy of wood and stone. As the years in solitary dragged on, Wurmbrand realized that his mind was either going to be a prison or a cathedral. To prevent mental atrophy, he began a rigorous process of internal archiving. He had no Bible, so he reconstructed the New Testament in his mind, verse by verse, from memory. He composed over 300 sermons, which he later published as Sermons in Solitary. Every night, he would deliver these sermons to an imaginary congregation. He would walk through the streets of Bucharest in his mind, visiting his parishioners, praying for them by name and preaching in the great squares. He was using his imagination as a sanctuary, proving that the inland can never be truly caged. Food was a weapon of the state. Wurmbrand was kept on a starvation diet, thin, watery soup with a piece of moldy bread. Instead of consuming it in despair, he turned his meager portions into a sacrament. He would save a few crumbs of his bread and a spoonful of his water to represent the Eucharist. In the absolute darkness of his cell, he would perform the liturgy of the rags. He would kneel on the cold floor and celebrate the Lord's Supper, declaring that even in the pit the King was present. This was the supply line of the Spirit, taking the nothing of the prison and turning it into the everything of the kingdom. Eventually the silence was broken not by a friend, but by the interrogator. Wurmbrand was dragged from his cell into a room flooded with blinding light. The officers were fresh, well-fed, and confident. "Richard," they would say, using his name only to manipulate him. "Your wife is gone. Your son has forgotten you. The church has moved on. Why die for a myth? Just give us the names of the underground couriers, and you can walk out into the sun today." Wurmbrand's response was a masterclass in psychological sovereignty. He didn't argue theology. He simply looked at them with a pity they couldn't understand. He realized that the interrogators were the true prisoners, shackled by their own hatred and the party line. He began to see his captors as his mission field. When psychological isolation failed to produce a betrayal, the Securitate transitioned to the mechanical phase. Wurmbrand was moved from the quiet of solitary to the interrogation wings, where the air was thick with the sounds of human suffering. The communist objective was no longer just information, it was the annihilation of the will. They believed that every man had a price of pain at which his convictions would dissolve. Wurmbrand was subjected to a liturgy of pain that lasted for years. He was beaten with rubber truncheons on the soles of his feet until the flesh was pulverized, a torture known as bastinado. He was then forced to jump up and down to keep the blood circulating so the pain would not be dulled by numbness. By the end of his ordeal, Richard Wurmbrand's body was a forensic map of communist cruelty. He carried 18 deep, permanent scars carved into his torso and limbs. Guards would use knives to carve slogans into the skin of believers that he was branded like cattle to signify he was property of the party. He was placed in a room of ice-cold metal where the temperature was dropped to near freezing. As he began to die of hypothermia, guards would rush in, revive him with hot soup, and then immediately begin the interrogation again. It was in the midst of this physical wreckage that Wurmbrand discovered the secret of the martyr. He realized that if he focused on his own pain, he would break. He had to perform a spiritual exchange. He began to view his body not as his own, but as a temple where Christ was suffering again. He later wrote, "It was not I who was in the cell, it was Jesus in me." This wasn't a poetic metaphor, it was a survival tactic. By detaching his self from his senses, he entered a state of ecstatic endurance. The more they beat him, the more he retreated into the inland of the spirit, where the great physician tended to his soul even as the guards destroyed his nerves. The most radical defiance in Jalava was not silence, but love. Wurmbrand began to audit the souls of his torturers. He realized that the men beating him were victims of the same dragon that held him prisoner. During the breaks in his torture, while he lay bleeding on the concrete floor, he would look up at his tormentors and say, "I do not hate you. I pray for your soul. You are a man made in the image of God, even if you have forgotten it." This was spiritual guerrilla warfare. It disarmed the guards. They were trained to handle hatred. They were not trained to handle grace. Several guards were so unnerved by his mercy that they secretly brought him extra bread or whispered, "Pray for me, Pastor," before the next shift of officers arrived. The ultimate torture was not the truncheon but the truth sieve. The Securitate would bring in forged letters or play recordings of voices that sounded like his wife, Sabina, and his son, Mihai. They told him Sabina had remarried. They told him his son had renounced Christ and joined the Communist Youth League. Wurmbrand stood in his own Gethsemane. He had to decide, is God enough if everything on earth is a lie? He realized that the dragon was trying to steal his future because it couldn't break his past. He made a silent vow, "Even if all I have heard is true, even if I am the last believer on earth, I will not move." This was the moment the refined gold reached its highest purity. He had lost everything, identity, family, health, leaving only the presence. By the end of this phase, the Securitate realized they had a problem. Wurmbrand had become a spiritual radiator in the prison. Other prisoners, seeing his endurance, were finding faith. The pit was becoming a cathedral. The guards began to fear him. They saw him not as a broken man, but as a presence they couldn't explain. To stop the infection of his faith, they decided to move him to a more isolated, more lethal facility, Gurla Prison. The furnace was about to be turned up to its maximum heat. After the subterranean silence of Jalava, Richard Wurmbrand was moved to Gurla Prison. If Jalava was designed to bury a man, Gurla was designed to reprogram him. The Securitate had shifted their strategy from simple containment to ideological erasure. Wurmbrand was placed in the re-education wings, where the air was constantly filled with the mechanical drone of loudspeakers. 4 weeks on end, 16 hours a day, a rhythmic, monotonous voice repeated the same script. "Christianity is dead. Christianity is dead. No one believes anymore. You are the last fool left." The communists were attempting a digital wipe of his soul. They wanted to replace his internal library of scripture with the static of the state. Wurmbrand's counter-strategy was a form of spiritual guerrilla warfare. He realized that if he couldn't stop the noise, he had to outsing it. He began to compose poetry in his head, meticulously structured verses that rhymed in German and Romanian, to create a new rhythm for his mind to latch onto. He was rewriting the gospel into the very air of the cell. In 1956, a brief political thaw swept through the Soviet bloc. In a move of calculated mercy, the regime released a small group of religious prisoners. Richard Wurmbrand emerged from the gates of Gurla as a walking skeleton. He was a man with shadowed lungs, a body marked by the liturgy of the blood, and a heart that had forgotten the sound of a bird's song. The state gave him a condition: "You are free provided you never speak of the pit. Never preach. Never gather. Be a ghost." But a heart that has been refined in the inland cannot be silent. Wurmbrand immediately returned to the underground. He began to move through the back alleys of Bucharest, organizing secret meetings in the Carpathian forests. He told his people, "I have seen the face of the dragon, and I have found that the Lamb is stronger. We have nothing to fear from the dark, for the dark is where the light is most visible." His freedom lasted less than 3 years. In 1959 he was rearrested. The net had closed again, and this time the sentence was a death warrant, 25 years of hard labor. By the early 1960s, the Romanian economy was in a state of terminal decay. The regime, led by Gheorghe Georgedej and later Ceausescu, discovered a new commodity for export: human beings. They began a secret program of selling political and religious dissidents to the West for hard currency. Western intelligence and the Norwegian mission to the Jews began to hear whispers of a ghost pastor who had survived the worst of the Securitate's torture sites. A forensic negotiation began. The communists viewed Wurmbrand not as a man, but as a damaged asset. The price for Richard, Sabina, and their son Mihai was set at $10,000. In 1964, this was a staggering sum, the equivalent of a small fortune in the East. Christian organizations in the West scrambled to raise the funds, performing a digital collection across continents. This was the supply line of the saints in action. The money was paid in secret, through back channels that bypassed the public eye. In December 1964, Richard Wurmbrand was told to pack his few rags. He was led out of the prison gates for the final time. He was driven to the border, where he was met by his wife, Sabina, who herself had survived 3 years in a labor camp on the Danube-Black Sea Canal. As they crossed the bridge into the West, the guards mocked him, "Go to your capitalists. They will forget you in a month." But the guards didn't realize that they weren't releasing a broken asset. They were releasing a resurrection. Wurmbrand arrived in the West not as a refugee but as a witness. He realized that his name had been resurrected from the archives of the dead so that he could be a voice for the millions who were still in the inland of the pit. He looked at his scarred hands and realized his mission was just beginning. He had been purchased with a price twice, once by the blood of the king and once by the ransom of the saints. Before he ever set foot on an American stage, Wurmbrand spent his first weeks of freedom codifying the laws of the underground. He realized that the Western Church was sleeping in its comfort, unaware that a refiner's fire was coming for them too. He began to draft the manuscripts that would become Tortured for Christ, a book designed to be a spiritual alarm clock. He didn't want sympathy, he wanted a supply line of prayer and action. He was no longer a pastor of a local church, he was now the apostle to the silent. When Richard Wurmbrand arrived in the United States in 1966, he found a church that was deep in the inland of luxury and complacency. The Western world was embroiled in the Cold War, but for many the persecution of Christians behind the Iron Curtain was a distant myth, a political exaggeration. Wurmbrand, with his hollowed eyes and his body that seemed to be held together by sheer spiritual will, was an uncomfortable presence. He didn't speak the language of prosperity, he spoke the language of the stone. He realized that the dragon had a different tactic for the West: apathy. While the communists used the tiger chair to break the body, the West used comfort to rot the soul. He knew he had to perform a radical act to wake the sleeping giant of the global Ecclesia. On May 6, 1966, Richard Wurmbrand was called to testify before the U.S. Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. The hearing room was cold, filled with journalists and skeptical politicians who were debating the diplomatic nuances of dealing with Romania. They expected a lecture on political theory, they were not prepared for a witness of the flesh. In the middle of his testimony, as he described the refrigerator cells and the mock executions, Wurmbrand sensed the room's disbelief. He stopped speaking. In a moment that has become the final signature of his life, he stood up and began to unbutton his shirt. "My body is a book," he told the senators. "Each scar is a page. The church in the East is being refined in a fire you cannot imagine. I am here to let the skin speak where the voice cannot." He stripped to the waist, turning his back to the cameras. The room went into a stunned, absolute silence. Across his back and torso were the 18 deep, jagged scars, the deep grooves of the knives, the circular burns of the irons, and the raised welts of the truncheons. It was a forensic proof of the great Red Dragon's work. The images were broadcast across the globe, shattering the narrative that persecution was a thing of the past. The scars of Jalava had become the signature of the suffering church. The Senate testimony was the supply line that Wurmbrand needed. He didn't use his newfound fame for personal gain. He used it to build a geopolitical pipeline of grace. He founded Voice of the Martyrs, VOM, an organization designed to find the inland battlefields where believers were still being processed through the furnace. He developed a missionary intelligence network that smuggled Bibles into the Soviet bloc, supported the families of the imprisoned, and published the news from the underground. He turned the Morse code of his prison cell into a global broadcast. He wrote his masterpiece, Tortured for Christ, which he drafted in a feverish 3-day session. The book was a spiritual alarm clock, stripping away the dross of consumer Christianity and replacing it with the raw, exchanged life of the martyr. Wurmbrand spent the next 3 decades traveling the world. He was a man who abided in a state of permanent mourning and permanent joy. Even as his body grew frail from the long-term effects of tuberculosis and the iron boot, his spirit remained a furnace. He often visited the very countries that had tortured him, sneaking back across borders to preach in the same underground he had helped build. In his final years, Richard and Sabina lived a life of radical simplicity. They had looked into the eyes of the dragon for 14 years and discovered that the dragon was impotent against a soul that had already died to itself. Richard Wurmbrand passed into the presence of the king in 2001. He died not as a victim but as a victor. He had proven that there is no place on earth, no matter how deep or dark, where the supply line of the Spirit cannot reach. The church is most alive when it is stripped of its buildings and forced into the inland of the heart. The furnace is still burning. From the black sites of Asia to the hidden cells of the Middle East, the gold is still being refined. Richard Wurmbrand's name was erased by the state, but it is written in the stone of the eternal city. The question is no longer, will you suffer? But what will remain when the fire reaches you? Write the gold remains in the comments to sign this archive. Let it be your vow to remember those in bonds as if you were bound with them. Subscribe to the Ecclesia Chronicles. We don't bring you success manuals, we bring you the dying and rising breaths of the saints.